Abraham Lincoln developed a reputation for being a politician with integrity, honor, and ethics, which is why he was nicknamed Honest Abe. He was also called the Great Emancipator for his role in ending slavery. Another example, John F. Kennedy was simply known as JFK after the initials in his name. It was basic, but instantly recognizable and memorable. The point is that even when you're President of the United States, you don't always get addressed with the esteem that your position should demand. Sure, some nicknames are meant to be jovial, even loving, but plenty of others are belittling or just plain weird. We've all heard of Tricky Dick and the Gipper, but here are the stories behind 10 other bizarre presidential nicknames. Number 10. The Last Cocked Hat. Fashion can be a fickle mistress, even when you are the commander-in-chief. That's the lesson that James Monroe, 5th President of the United States, learned when he became known as the Last Cocked Hat. The moniker referenced Monroe's outdated sartorial choices. Even though he was in office during the 1820s, he still dressed in the manner common during the American Revolution: knee breeches, white powdered wigs, and the tricorn hat. The presidents who followed him adopted more modern fashion choices, which is why Monroe was called the Last Cocked Hat. The nickname followed him around for the rest of his life, and although we don't know how Monroe felt about it, we can at least say that the epithet was still an affectionate one and was never intended to be used in a derogatory manner, which is definitely not the case for all the entries on this list. Speaking of which, number 9, 10-cent Jimmy. To quote, there's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you, shame on you. Fool me, you can't get fooled again." This little gaffe from George W. Bush taught him that when you're President of the United States, everything you say is scrutinized, and your political opponents are more than happy to criticize you whenever you put your foot in your mouth. This is especially true during an election when just one flub could cost you the race, as James Buchanan almost found out to his own detriment. During the 1856 presidential election, Democratic Party candidate James Buchanan drew the ire of the working classes when he said that he thought that 10 cents a day represented a fair wage for manual laborers. The Republicans pounced on the opportunity and mockingly referred to Buchanan as 10-cent Jimmy, a nickname that followed him at rallies throughout the election campaign. This could have cost Buchanan the election, but he played the slavery card, claiming that each state should decide on its own whether slavery should be outlawed or not, whereas his Republican opponent, John C. Fremont, wanted the practice abolished in the entire country. This secured Buchanan the Southern vote and won in the election, despite his 10-cent Jimmy gaffe. Number 8. Uncle Jumbo. There were quite a few presidents who were well known for their voracious appetites and prodigious girths. One of them was Grover Cleveland, the 22nd and 24th President of the United States, best remembered for being the only one in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. In fact, weighing between 260 and 280 pounds during his political career, Cleveland was the second heaviest US president in history, behind only William Taft, but more on him later. It's no surprise then that Cleveland had gained the moniker Uncle Jumbo. However, it seems that the nickname at least came from a place of affection, starting with his nieces and nephews and then extending to his friends and family. Cleveland embraced the name and used it to paint this picture of himself as the friendly, caring uncle, which resonated with the voters and helped get him elected. Number 7. The Human Iceberg. The Human Iceberg sounds like a nickname you would give to an NFL player or maybe a supervillain, but instead it went to the 23rd President of the US, Benjamin Harrison. Allegedly, this sobriquet was due to his private character, which was frigid, quiet, and stiff, in stark contrast to his lively and engaging public persona. Put Harrison in front of a crowd of 30,000, and he would have no problem capturing and captivating their attention. But place him in a room with just a handful of people, and he would struggle to string words together for longer than 2 minutes. Critics of Harrison believed the Human Iceberg moniker also suited his presidency, since he slowly lumbered through it without any events of note. Number 6. Big Lub. As we previously mentioned, Grover Cleveland was the second heaviest president after William Howard Taft, who weighed up to 350 pounds during his time in office. Nowadays, Taft is most famous for being so fat that he once got stuck in the bathtub of the White House, although that story is likely an urban legend that doesn't really hold water. Even so, it is true that Taft was mocked in his time for his size and appetite, often being referred to as Big Lub. While you may say that didn't sound worse than Uncle Jumbo, it was the maliciousness behind the words that made the difference. While Uncle Jumbo was a term of endearment for Cleveland from his family, Big Lub was a nickname that Taft picked up during his school years, and it haunted him for his whole life, even when he became president of the United States. At least his wife Nellie had a more affectionate moniker for the portly president. She called him Sleeping Beauty because Taft often nodded off at parties. Number 5. Uncle Cornpone. While we are discussing hurtful nicknames, we have to include Uncle Cornpone, a moniker reserved for the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson. In this case, Cornpone refers to a rural, unsophisticated person, thus ridiculing LBJ's southern roots since he was born in Texas. But the most upsetting thing about that nickname was who came up with it. It was none other than the Kennedys. While Johnson served as vice president, JFK and his brothers mocked him by calling him Uncle Cornpone or Rufus Cornpone. But perhaps even more hurtful was their name for LBJ's wife, Lady Bird Johnson, who they referred to as Uncle Cornpone's little pork chop. Number 4, the Madman from Massachusetts. Again, the Madman from Massachusetts sounds like the kind of nickname that you'd use for someone making their way to the ring at WrestleMania, but instead it was the moniker given to the 6th President of the United States, John Quincy Adams. What did Adams do that got him branded as a madman? Well, he dared question the value of slavery. Initially, Adams deemed slavery immoral, but necessary in order to continue the Union. As the years went on, he blossomed into a full-blown abolitionist who believed that either the South would abolish slavery or there would be civil war. As you might imagine, such ideas earned him plenty of enemies, especially south of the Mason-Dixon line. He narrowly avoided an official motion to be censored for his anti-slavery agitation back in 1842 when he was still a member of the House of Representatives. He garnered plenty of snubs and even threats on his life for his actions, so in retrospect, being called the Madman from Massachusetts was far from the worst thing that he had to endure. Number 3, the Sphinx. Weirdly enough, there were 2 American presidents who were called the Sphinx. The first one is pretty straightforward. Calvin Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States, was renowned as a man of few words, so he earned quite a few nicknames that referenced his taciturn demeanor. Silent Cow, Cautious Cow, and the strangest of all, the Sphinx of the Potomac. The story behind the second nickname is a bit more interesting, and it comes from Franklin D. Roosevelt, the only American president to serve 3 terms, even though he actually won 4. The nickname has to do with his third elusive presidential term. In 1939, FDR appeared ready to hang up his boots once his second term would end in 1940, following the presidential tradition of retiring after 2 turns as commander-in-chief. However, after World War II broke out, there was a lot of speculation that Roosevelt might run for a 3rd term to guide his country through the crisis. On this issue, FDR kept his cards close to his chest and said very little in the lead-up to the election. This prompted several newspapers to publish cartoons depicting Roosevelt as the Great Sphinx of Giza, unwilling to share the answer to the 3rd term question with anyone else. Then, on the evening of December 9th, 1939, FDR attended the Gridiron Club's winter dinner as the guest of honor. This included Washington journalists doing skits and poking fun at politicians, and the highlight of the night involved them bringing out an 8-foot-tall statue of papier-mâché with Roosevelt as the Sphinx. FDR loved it so much that he asked to keep it after the night was over, and it still sits at a place of honor inside the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. Number 2, his fraudulency, Rutherford B. Hayes. We have another twofer here, except this one involves 2 nicknames for the same president instead of the other way around. When Rutherford B. Hayes became the 19th President of the United States, he did so under a cloud of controversy. The 1876 election was fraught with dissension because Hayes' opponent, Samuel J. Tilden, actually won the popular vote. He was leading in the electoral vote as well, but the race was so close in 3 states that both parties claimed the win. A special commission was set up by Congress to determine the winner, and they declared the election in favor of Hayes, 185 electoral votes to 184. After Hayes took office, his fiercest critics accused him of striking a corrupt bargain to win the presidency and gave him 2 nicknames to remind him of his undeserving win: his fraudulency and Rutherford B. Hayes. Number 1, the Dude President. Without a doubt, the coolest presidential nickname goes to Chester A. Arthur, who was known as the Dude President. It's a little weird how a man who constantly ranks among the most forgettable presidents got such a snazzy sobriquet, but it makes sense since the word had a slightly different meaning back then. Arthur didn't become known as the Dude because he put a rug in the Oval Office that really tied the room together. Instead, he gained it due to his love of fashion, fripperies, and the finer things in life. Back then, a dude basically meant a dandy, a young man completely devoted to the latest styles and fads. And Chester A. Arthur was one such man. Tales of his expensive habits became common during his stay in office. He spent over $30,000 in 1880 money just to redecorate the White House and make it more glamorous for his parties. He had a wardrobe full of silk top hats and expensive clothes and shoes imported from Europe that would put any contemporary heiress or fashionista to shame. Arthur also wasn't exactly what you'd call a workaholic. He was definitely a man who cherished his free time. Unsurprisingly, the Dude nickname was used derogatorily in his own time, but Arthur didn't seem to mind too much because he understood the golden rule: the dude abides.